All right, welcome to the Creative Confidence Series. We usually hosted by IDEO. Today, the IDEO CoLab is somewhat taking over, and we're going to talk about the distributed web. I'm Joe Gerber, managing director of the IDEO CoLab, and this is
Gavin McDermott. Run our help run with Dan, our distributed web lab.
If you don't know what the IDEO CoLab is, we're very fortunate to have to get to work with the IDEO folks for this webinar. The IDEO CoLab is IDEO's R&D and venture studio, and we focus on emerging technologies like Bitcoin and blockchain, AI, machine learning. We kind of take a new approach to how we learn about those opportunities and act on them. So we kind of have two core principles. One is we believe in a collaborative network. So we want to do things. We believe fundamentally that doing things together is better than doing them on our own. So we can ask shared questions, we can share resources, we can share risk, and we can share reward. That's one core principle of the CoLab. The other one is we learn and we collaborate by building stuff. So we build lots and lots of prototypes around different emerging technologies. So that's the CoLab. But today we're going to focus in on one of the areas that we've been working on for 3 years plus, depending on which team member you have on our team. And Gavin has actually been in the Bitcoin and blockchain space for longer than that. But we wanted to talk about the distributed web, and we wanted to first talk about probably the elephant in the room, because we're not really going to talk about Bitcoin today. But I'm sure you're all wondering, because Bitcoin has been skyrocketing for the past few months. I think it's at like $18,000 for a Bitcoin right now.
16 something last night.
Oh, it dropped because of the fork.
Wait, now it's 20. No.
So this is not going to be a webinar about Bitcoin, but we just quickly wanted to talk about Bitcoin. But then really, this is help you see that Bitcoin is just one small piece of a larger distributed web movement, and we're going to focus mostly on everything but Bitcoin. So Gavin, I don't know if you have anything to add about what's going on in Bitcoin land since you've been living there. That Gavin built the first secure Bitcoin wallet.
Yeah, online multi-sig wallet at BitGo, which was a lot of fun. That was a lot of years ago. The ecology has changed.
What's your like 2 sentences on what's going on with Bitcoin, and then
2 sentences with what's going on with Bitcoin. It is the thing you'll read headlines about. So there's a lot of gravity around it. So that's what everybody talks about. So as kind of the flagship, like cryptocurrency, that's what's going to draw a lot of attention. It's also the thing that's being traded on the futures exchanges, and so it's making a lot of noise. But behind the noise, there's a lot of movement happening that's just as important, if not more. And so it's about discernment. And so what we're going to do is kind of we're going to try to craft some tools that allow you to discern the important things behind the movement and noise that is Bitcoin.
That's cool. And so I think we're interested in things beyond Bitcoin. We view this truly as a movement. And we like to talk more about blockchain and the distributed web. And so maybe what we can do is first define what we mean by that. So Gavin, how would you really simply describe the blockchain, which is just one piece of the distributed web?
Yeah, the blockchain is a peer-to-peer network that propagates shared information that's provable. And so it's actually really simple. It's just a data structure that everybody shares, and so you can't lie about things. And as facts are added, everybody agrees on those facts. And so then you can do entirely new types of things. It's nothing really crazy, but it is also crazy.
Yeah. So to my simplistic brain, I liked, I think Vitalik Buterin, who's one of the creators of Ethereum, he said at one point he said it's a database we all agree on, and that really resonated with me. I know that that's not a perfect description, but that was one way to help. And then the other factor of blockchain that really sticks in my brain is this idea of digital scarcity. And so I think it's really important. Like, part of that shared record allows everybody to agree that there's only one copy of something. And in the first case, there's only one copy of a particular Bitcoin, which then solves something called the double spend problem. And think about, you can copy a PDF and send it to as many people as you want. That's great for PDFs. That's not great for digital money, because then the money has no value in that case. So they've solved this digital scarcity problem, which is interesting. And to expand back to the broader distributed web, it's interesting to think about digital scarcity beyond money. So how do you give people, things, data points a unique digital identity, and then what can you do with it? And that kind of starts to allude to bring us to the broader distributed web. So how would you describe that? So I think we've talked about peer-to-peer networks, we've talked about a distributed ledger. How would you encompass the broader distributed web? I'd add one piece, which is it's like, because there's currencies with value, there's a mechanism for economic coordination.
Yes. Well, it's like money. We've talked about this a lot. Finance is the Trojan horse. It's the Trojan horse because it's the thing that we all understand. And so money just happened to be a thing that works, because and the idea of digital scarcity, it's kind of magic. It's like, if you think about, computers are really good at copying things infinitely, making infinite copies, and then to just somehow like magically limit it to one thing that everybody has to agree upon, and suddenly there's no more infinite copying. It's kind of a magic thing that, it wasn't in the consciousness a decade ago, but now it's a thing we kind of get and we're playing with. So what that's caused is this kind of massive restructuring, or this massive rethink. And so that's like what the distributed web, or this movement, is. It's a complete reimagining of the infrastructure that sits around today, which is why it's making so many waves in a lot of different areas, whether it's legal or financial or creative, or it's kind of everywhere.
You've said once that the web is being rewritten from the inside out, which was really inspiring to me, and I quote it all the time now. But that was again, for someone who's not as deep in the technology as you are. For me, that was like an unlock to think about what's actually happening. And so you're a student of the history of the internet, and you read papers from the 60s, and you go to conferences and things. And I mean, one thing that I think we kind of know, but don't think too much about, is like, the web was originally distributed. So what's different now? Like, why isn't the internet already a distributed web?
No.
Yeah.
So it has become and this, you might read this somewhere or you might not. It's like, but the internet as we know it has largely become a centralized entity. And so that's what most people are kind of dealing with. And
so when you say that, you're talking about Google, Facebook.
Yeah, and a lot of these things. And then the way that shows up in headlines, and probably those of you who are listening might see that as like, oh, well, then you can buy advertisements in Facebook and swing something, or you can reach a broad audience, because that broad audience is kind of focused in one channel, which is kind of that's the effect. So we're kind of rolling back from the effect and going, well, what's the cause of this, and how do we change that? And so that's some of the restructuring.
A lot of people, when describing what this is and what it might mean, they reference email and the protocol that underlies email, and how, if you have Gmail, you can send an email to somebody who has Yahoo, or does that even exist anymore, or Hotmail. I'm not sure if that exists anymore.
Lawsuit.
Dating myself. No, but the point being, it's a interoperable kind of protocol where it's just about moving a certain type of message from one place to another. And when you say the web is being rewritten from the inside out, it's like it's taking things like that. Well, that's already distributed. Now it's layering on additional kind of infrastructural layers of the internet. Payments is a great example of that, but communication is another one that I know you've been thinking a lot about, and governance, and starting to open those things up in the same way that email did.
And there's also the reason it's from the inside out, that's used because if you're looking from the outside in, it's hidden, right? The changes up to the system are kind of are happening behind the scenes. And so the headlines will show you kind of the sensationalization of what is, but it's really important, if you're like building a business for tomorrow or building something for tomorrow, to understand the scope of what's happening and the fact that it is taking place behind the scenes. And once you understand that, then you can design for it, then you can build for it, then you can see what's coming down the pipeline and prepare, if not just make the thing that is new and needed.
Cool. So we brought 3 principles. We're trying to keep it really high level and simple about what we think this new infrastructure is going to look and feel like. And so we're trying to help create a fuzzy but well, not fuzzy, a clear but still early lens as to what a fully distributed web would look and feel like. And we'll try to give examples of existing projects that speak to some of these principles. So again, this is bigger than Bitcoin, and we want to start by talking about
Bitcoin. I'm kidding.
The idea of permission by default.
Yes.
So when you have a centralized system, you're asking for permission to access something, and in the distributed web, you start with permission. Can you talk more about what that actually, like, what does that mean?
That means that it's like, I mean, it's, some of these things are so simple and obvious that you state it and then you go, what? And then you have to state the same thing again in order to like kind of start to let it steep in you. But it's the fact that
I live in the world of obvious.
So do I, and I miss a lot of it. The idea that you have permission by default means that you don't have to ask anybody to do a thing. You can just start participating in a system. For the last ever, you've always had to ask some large entity to play in the large game of the economy. Let's just say you have to have a bank account. You have to have a thing. So you go to a bank and you sign up a thing, but that requires you to have, a driver's license or some piece of identity. So they go to the other system, and so you have two systems now interacting pretty closely. But in these new types of things, you have none of that. You use math and you get an identity, and you have that just blah. And so then you can participate in that system by virtue of the fact that you want to participate in that system. Nobody can stop you. And so, that leads to really important changes. There's a generation growing up with the expectation of participation.
So let me unpack that a little bit. So, because I think I heard two things. One was what we touched on earlier, but just to reiterate it, you can create unique digital identities for people that become universal.
And also, this starts to push on what identity is. Like, we're stepping into a completely new space of what identity is and means.
Yep.
It's always been tied to a thing that you could see or look at, but now it's just it's a different abstraction that we're just starting to we're being forced into understanding it, which is a really great thing.
So just to go down that thread for a second, there's a really interesting area of the distributed web around digital identity. What does reputation mean? There's a lot of different projects around that.
Yeah.
And to your point, like that starts to change the shape of identity. And then the last one is about taking your data back, right? So how do you attach your data, which could be your reputation, could be other things, to your identity, and then you have control over how you share that in different contexts. So that's one really interesting area, and that there's probably more to talk about there. The second piece that I heard in your description is on the permission by default side is it's the openness of these networks, where yes, you need an identity, but you don't. But anyone, because it's an open system, anyone can participate. Yes. Which is I think the analogy here is, anybody can throw up a website as long as they participate by the protocol's rules, right? Yeah. And or anyone can put packets of information onto the web and they get moved around is the base, at the most basic level, what the internet does. So net neutrality aside, that I had to get that in there. I think what you're saying is there's other places that we're not even thinking about, where we're asking for permission where we don't need to, right? And so maybe we can talk about a few examples of what that looks like.
Yeah. I'm gonna throw in one other thing. Yeah, it's like this is my Marshall McLuhan bit because I haven't done any research behind it, but it's like there's a big social change that's implied, and so in every company, as you're there's a generation gap, and it's like the older generation thinks that the younger ones think they're entitled, and it's because they expect they've had the ability to participate. The older generation hasn't, and so when the younger one shows up and just says, let me have access, I deserve access, there's these weird and very, very I guess they're very visceral. You feel the experience between the two generations in this way. And I don't mean generation by age. I just mean generation in terms of how you think, because it's age agnostic. But yeah, so projects, like examples.
Yeah, what are some cool things that kind of bring that to life, or some of the other things we're talking about?
The most meaningful one is like what we've talked about a little bit. Or not most meaningful. It was a really important one earlier this year. In April, in Turkey, Wikipedia went black, or went down. It was what that means, and nobody could access it. And so there's a project called IPFS, which is one of those things rewriting the way the internet works, or the web works from the inside out. And they made an entire copy of Wikipedia, and then, in the native languages, and then stored it in a distributed fashion. So a bunch of nodes sprung up to host this, and then you could access Wikipedia in the like language germane to the area. I forget how quickly, but it was relatively quickly. It was like within a week. But it was a community effort to make sure you could access information in a way that you couldn't, even 2 years ago.
That's a great example, and especially because it involves IPFS, which is another example of a non-currency distributed web company. Can you talk a little bit about what they are and how it works? Because it's another one of those protocol layers of the new web.
Yes, so it's not all about currency, like you're saying. It's about all the different layers that talk to each other and the roles they perform in a new way. And the group behind IPFS is called Protocol Labs. They're local here too. A really awesome group of humans, but they're focused on some of these longer term projects that you need a horizon that is not bound by profit. And it's bound a little bit more by reimagining things, which is no bound at all. So it's like they have the financial, like the structure and the people who can imagine new ways to build these types of things. So IPFS is one of the first manifestations like in the world of their of a new protocol that allows information to be shared in completely new ways.
Yeah. So it's a protocol that's about file sharing and more.
Yes.
But if you've seen the HBO show Silicon Valley, where they talk about distributed file sharing, it's kind of that, but real, and actually one of the most exciting projects in the distributed web space. Like as Gavin was saying, like the team behind it is
wonderful humans,
top notch, and so it's very real. So think of things like Dropbox, but distributed. So it's on all of our different devices, but it works, and more.
Yes, the next couple of years in terms of file sharing and file storage and how you even load websites and things like that, it's very, very different.
That was when the Dropbox analogy for them was how I got in. I understood that, but then once I realized how the internet works by pointing to file storage, like that's truly they're rewriting how the internet works.
Yes.
Maybe you can talk about how the websites getting stored on IPFS versus and their identity naming system will be different than the infrastructure we have today for the internet.
We're gonna have to keep this one at a high level.
Yeah.
It's totally. It's like let me think of this. The way this guy on their project, he was giving a talk at. He was a librarian, and I love that fact. And he was explaining that the way you get a web page today is the equivalent of, I want to see this web page, so I would have to, if I wanted to like read this book that is this web page, I'd have to fly to New York where it's served out of. I would have to go to the library, the building where it is, and somebody would say, oh yeah, it's on the top shelf on the back. And so I would walk up there to the top shelf on the back, and now what if that book is gone? SOL.
Mm-hmm.
Or what if it's a different book, but I don't know it's a different book. I just grabbed that thing that's there because it pointed to it by location. So everything right now today is by location. So you have to go to that location, and whatever you get, you get. You don't know if it's what you asked for.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're doing, and the way that IPFS kind of works, is you don't ask by location, you ask by content. And so it's I want to read, Catcher in the Rye. So somebody gives me back Catcher in the Rye. I don't care who, but I know I got Catcher in the Rye because I asked for it. That's a fundamental difference. And you have new types of things you can do with that, because you can prove that what you got is what you asked for. You can prove that somebody wasn't sitting in the middle and didn't change some bit of data in what you asked for. So you have all these new types of proofs that can be done just by a simple change in getting what you asked for.
So it's truly like, to take the library analogy back to the internet. It's truly a better way to store and share information, and know you're getting what you want to get. And
it can be, and it's gonna. I think it'll show itself to be that way over the next chunk of years. It's the very early day of this.
Nice.
Yeah.
So maybe we should move on to our next principle, which we're touching on already, but in the internet of today versus the distributed web, I think information is more controlled, and although data can be open in some places, I think in the distributed web world of the future, it feels like data is going to flow a lot more freely, and you've spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Yeah.
So this idea, well, I'm trying to cue you up. But the idea that like you helped me break some of my mental models around the nature of data flows, and like how, like, stream, like what we mean by streaming data, not just streaming video, but like actually like streaming data.
Yeah. Should I elaborate on this?
Yes, please.
Okay. It's like this. It's like if we've been in the space of everybody for the last while, everybody's been obsessed with, hold on to your data. It's your competitive advantage. And so there's been this mental model of like, well, I better keep everything I can get and just like dump it into a giant grain silo that holds data. And that's kind of everybody's mental model. And they're like, then we'll just at some point go back and run analytics on it, and poof, billions of dollars because analytics. And we're realizing like that's not necessarily where this is headed. That's a stepping stone to where we're going. And the where we're going feels like, as we have more and more connected things, it's a very natural thing for talk is cheap in both the physical and the digital space. And so it's very cheap for everything to just be speaking constantly. And then what you do with that, what you do with those different conversations, how you weave them together, how you make sense of them, and then forward your own conversation. So it's kind of like what's happening on this webinar. You and I are talking, but behind the scenes, there's people making sense of this and synthesizing. So you don't have to listen to all this. You can go read the synthesis. And so it's like the same thing is happening in the data space. It's like you'll be working with streaming information as opposed to siloed information. And so as opposed to reaching into and making sense of a big chunk, it's like, how do I just dip into living streams of information to make sense of it when I need to and how I need to? And can I recompose? It's a lot more like jazz than writing a giant concerto.
So let's unpack this one too, because it's mind melting. So the nature, the properties of the protocols are going to allow for that streaming and the dipping. There's elements of trust implied there, right? Like of opening up and sharing in certain ways, and then of giving back.
Yeah.
And then also, I think a psychological trust and mindset of abundance versus scarcity.
Yeah.
And I think we've been talking about that this morning in other contexts, but the idea of this is a world of abundance, and if you open up your data, like, you'll actually get back.
Yeah.
It's not just about an open data movement. It's about better business, better architecture for information,
better ecologies of systems. The old competitive advantage of I'm going to build the biggest walls and the thickest walls I can build, and that's gonna survive. That's great. That used to survive, but it will no longer. Like, if you want to be around in 10 years in the same way, then that's not what's going to work. What's emerging and what will emerge, because if you don't do it, all the little things around you will. The competitive advantage is going to be sharing information. And when you start to share with others, others will share with you, and you can then make sense of the entire system in a way that those who do not share will never see. And that is hard to understand if your mental model is it's all mine. But when you start to realize that you're part of a system and that you can do much more by sharing some of what you have, things start to change.
So there's, I know you've talked about this in the past about like trusting the system versus the individual data point or user or whatever. Where does that trust come from? Like, why should we trust this new system?
Well, let's start with, there's always trust. There always has been trust. And so before we even answer that, it's like, who did we used to trust? Well, we used to trust the brand, and we used to trust and this is an interesting thing just to say out loud, like we used to trust the brand. We used to trust institutions and organizations just at face value. But there's been kind of a massive change in that over the last 15 years where there's less trust in the brands and institutions. And you see that in almost every type of poll in lots of different contexts.
Yeah.
And so go ahead.
I'm going to push back a little bit. Like,
yeah,
I do think certain brands and institutions are broken and there's less trust for them. I totally agree with that. I think the idea of a brand is it's just an avatar for trust. Like it's a way to simplify trust. It's still a tool that I think we'll continue to use.
Completely agree.
But so I don't think brands go away. The idea of brands go away.
Neither do I.
I think new brands are going to emerge.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, by no means was I saying brands go away.
Yeah.
My statement is they will change, and they'll change because people don't trust them and expect to interact with them in the same way. And so as those expectations change, they'll need to change because they are a proxy for trust. But the thing that springs up in its place are the fact that you can trust some of the principles of these systems. You start to learn that you can review what are the rules of the system. Do I agree with them? Because all the rules will be laid out. Like right now, they're a little bit obtuse because you have to read code or you have to but that will not always be the case. It's like, so you can trust the rules and you can trust things.
So maybe what are a few examples? And I think we're going to try to leave 15 minutes at the end for time. So we'll get through this last principle next.
Yeah, I guess actually we can use Bitcoin as a perfect example here.
Sure.
If you trust the rules of Bitcoin's system, which is you need you have an identity and that identity has Bitcoins behind it, and you need a key to send Bitcoins, and you send them using this one language. If you agree to those rules because they're really simple, then you can play in the system. You don't have to trust anything about Bitcoin aside of those rules and the math behind it. There's no trust about is X or Y or Z. There's some weird, things about mining and that. But, generally speaking, do I agree with those rules? Do I trust them? Great. I'm in.
Right. And everyone's sharing
everybody agrees with that.
And participating.
Yeah.
Cool. Last principle. So we want to make sure we can answer some questions, is this idea of new types of coordination. This one, as a business guy, there's a whole economic system implied here, and we get distracted by the speculation and the financial market part of this. But really, this idea of native tokens with these systems, and these tokens represent value, but not in a dollars or what, pick your currency sort of way. They represent value in what do we value? How do we incentivize the right behaviors in order to coordinate a network?
Yeah.
And when you think about it at that level, it's really, really interesting. And I think what's implied, so sticking with the IPFS example, they have something called Filecoin. And yes, there's a market for it and people are financially speculating in it. But really the point of Filecoin is to incentivize the right behaviors to coordinate a network to share the copy of Wikipedia so that Turkey can't, so that it's up in Turkey, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about that is pretty interesting. And I know, how does that come to play in this future world of the distributed web?
It's in that way. It's it's really, and it's what you said in terms of incentivizing the behavior, and it's also incentivizing the structure of the network itself. So it's not just saying people store it, but I want lots of people to store this in lots of different locations and have, be able to kind of prove that lots of people have different copies of it. So that kind
it's
of creates
a healthy system.
Yeah. So you design the token to create the ecology that you'd like, which is really nice. You can kind of tune these things to tune the network, which is, again, you haven't had that before. Yeah. And so the type of coordination that this enables. Oh, off topic really quick. I saw somebody mention about brand on the last question thing, and it's brands really matter. I think it was all caps, and I totally agree. It's brands are a wonderful thing, and sorry, there's a diatribe there. But back to coordination. In the history of humans, in order to coordinate large groups of people across land and time, across thousands of miles or across decades, you'd need a government institution or a large company, and that's all that's been able to do it. But now you have these, since we're all connected digitally, now you have these networks that can coordinate people just based on rules. And so when you have things that have been used for thousands of years and suddenly you can use a new type of thing to coordinate, it's an important thing to understand. And we don't understand it yet. Like, we're just starting.
Can we give one quick example and then let's jump to questions? Maybe rep tokens, or what's another, aside from IPFS, what's another cool example of that coordination of people?
Coordination of people. Well, Estonia, like,
oh, sure.
the Estonian identity blockchain, like, they're coordinating an entire country's identity on one of these distributed ledgers in a new way. So it's like actually a mixing of the old and the new.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an entire country playing with this experiment that is, a distributed ledger, shared truth, and then what that means for the identity of citizens of that country. Like, because you can sign up, do I have to live there in order to have an identity there? Like, what are the rules? And so that's allowing that country to coordinate not only the people who live there, but people who don't live there in an entirely new way.
Yep, that's a great example. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes to go, and we wanted to try to answer some of your questions. So Anahi V asked, what are your thoughts on adapting blockchain technology to close the gap between traditional banking institutions and services and the needs of the people in developing countries?
Oh, this is a great one. I am so sincere in that. Oh, it's like,
Please go.
Closing the gap is a lot of these new companies that are, some in the South Pacific, I'm forgetting the name of one of them, but it's like they're from the ground up. And so a lot of these things have been started by people who grew up in cultures where, or environments where the traditional financial institutions didn't support their needs. And so these things are kind of being architected in a way that serves the needs of the people from the ground up. And so it's almost like, it's not about even closing the gap. It's just it's like just giving people kind of what they need. And so it's a new lattice to work on.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these principles apply, especially in the developing world. So the idea of participation and access. You're seeing things like Bitcoin actually has the most traction as not a store of value and speculative store of value, but an actual transactional currency in places like Argentina or developing countries where the fiat currency is very volatile and maybe like
extremely inflationary.
Yeah. Extremely inflationary, where it doesn't make sense to hold whatever the local currency is. So that's one example. I think and one thing we should actually say about all of this is it's really, really early days. Like this is about, like, if we were building a building, we're like pouring concrete and like putting in steel girders. It's not about we're not ready to put in windows or paint or furniture or
and
any
the blueprints are still changing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and people are fighting about the blueprints. So that's true for the developing world, but that's true about everything we're talking about. But otherwise, in the developing world, we're talking to an entrepreneur who had a business where his company was installing solar panels in India, and he heard about tokens and cryptocurrencies and thinks that there's a way to start to separate the value creation of solar energy from its geography. So you can give away maybe free solar panels and they'll produce an asset that doesn't have to be spent in a developing country. They can be spent or transferred in anywhere in the world. And so that starts to open up ways, like new business models for how to give people access to things like solar power. So that's pretty cool. Another question from Andy. Do you know of, or is IDEO working on, a guide that helps designers get started with blockchain? I'm thinking of something like Circular Design Guide. Yes.
Yes.
We are working on that exactly. Stay tuned. It's cool to hear that you're even asking that.
Yeah.
That should be a kick in the pants for us to finish this.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
But if you follow us on Twitter, we've posted a few things along those lines, but we haven't published a full-on design guide. But yes, check out our Twitter. There's some of that stuff is there, but we're working on something more formal. Mary H, can you define what exactly the distributed web is?
Yes, I'll and my definition will be one, throw it out the window. There will be many more. Mine is just, it's a set of protocols and peer-to-peer networks and systems that, yeah, it's I guess it's a movement that encompasses protocols and networks that are creating like a new type of infrastructure for information sharing and everything. I guess that was terrible.
Well, I would say to Mary and anybody else who feels like this is pretty abstract, like I'd go back to the building analogy, right? Like I think there's this shared vision that people have about what the distributed web is, and that's why we're talking about it at the kind of like at the principle level, because it's not fully real yet, even though there's lots of real things happening. And so again, like when you think about pouring concrete and steel girders and that sort of stuff, when you're building a big building, that's the infrastructural piece that's being built today. And those are the protocols. So right now it's a bunch of protocols and systems that might enable a lot of new things.
I gotta interrupt. I just saw in the chat here somebody said buy or install MetaMask. I'm just like, yes, we know that team well. Wonderful product. Because somebody's asking, how do I use these things? Great.
Well, pick up that question. How would we recommend people getting involved and learning about this stuff? And I feel obligated to say there are no like investment recommendations that are happening here today. This is not about that at all. But this is about like dipping, as to use your analogy of dipping into the stream of what's going on. Like I think the high level answer is the way to start to learn about this stuff and understand it is to participate. And there's lots of ways to do that.
And it's all like in participating, it's going to help you understand it. And the reason to understand it is so that you can answer the questions that you're asking. I saw one in the stream about how does this help with corruption. Well, you start to understand that when you're sharing truth and everybody agrees on truth, then corruption is kind of like if you're playing by those systems rules, that doesn't really it's harder to do, just much harder by virtue of the fact of the system that you're in. So and that gets to one of the next questions of how does this help design thinking? Danny asks, how does blockchain help design thinking? And okay, so let's use blockchain. So like blockchain is not like a thing. It's like how do blockchains is maybe like the way we can do that. It's like because there's many types of them. They're just a structure, but it helps design thinking because you have new principles to design with. It's like if you're an artist, all of a sudden you have 20 more colors to paint with, and because we have these new principles, you can design entirely new systems. Like where in the past you might have had to say, well, we need to ask X and Y to do something. Now you can just say, well, we'll put some of this information in the open. Everybody will have to agree on it, and then we can move forward.
That's actually how we think about all emerging technologies inside of the CoLab is as designers, as human-centered designers, we're interested in the properties of these new technologies because they're tools or that allow us to create new solutions. So that's broadly how I think it's going to help design thinking. We've got another question from Ben T. How does designing for the blockchain change or impact the process of human-centered design? That's related. I think I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I think we're going to have more access to people. And for example, this idea of tokens and incentive systems to coordinate behaviors, like just to make a really specific example that is not real, but you could start to imagine coordinating design research with a community of people that like yourselves who are interested in design thinking and this idea of getting value for participation is, I think, embedded into these worlds. And so that could be one way that it shows up.
Yeah. There was, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just looking at some of the other questions.
I really like the next one from Elizabeth. Yeah. Elizabeth P. What would you say are the biggest disadvantages showing up with this technology? It's like, I don't think we know yet. I think there are some dystopian futures that we can create, like very obviously. It's like everybody, if everything is seen, then everything is seen. Like, so there is.
I have two that I've heard come up.
Oh, yeah.
But first I'll say that I'm borrowing from somebody else here, but I heard somebody talking about all new technologies in this way, like using fire as an analogy. If we were cave people and fire was just invented, half the people would be like, this is amazing, we can cook food, we're staying warm. And half the people would say like, there's going to be like wildfires raging, we're all going to die. And they're both right? Like fire is neither good nor bad. Like, it depends how you use it, and I think that's true for all technologies, including blockchain. The two kind of disadvantages that are becoming somewhat clear, and I don't think are permanent. One is a lot of people talk about the energy usage of proof of work.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that you share this network is you've got a lot of computers doing math problems and using a lot of electricity. And so that could be a problem, but I think there's a lot of people working on interesting projects to make that less of a problem. Everything from, I think it's in New Zealand, but I'm blanking, but there's like a group that's putting a mining operation. So a place where they're running these computers that are doing the math near kind of renewable energy sources and using that excess renewable energy to power the nodes in the network, to things like getting away from proof of work entirely. So getting into proof of stake and other things like that.
Yeah.
So that's one. The other one that I think there's less of an answer to, but I am kind of concerned with, is some of the nature of how these networks are structured right now. It may mean that in a sense, and I don't mean rich people, like people with a lot of fiat currency today, but like it's the network might reinforce like winners and create more inequality, even if it desires to create more access and equality. And so I don't know, I don't have a good answer to that, but I think that could be a downside to these sorts of technologies if we're not careful. And like fire, I think we just have to start to surface potential places where there's unintended consequences and design around that. And
yeah. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, please.
I was just agreeing. But careful is a nice word. It's like there needs to be, not needs to, but we're approaching this with a sense of care and a little bit of stewardship. It's the early days. And so having that as kind of some guiding principles, in terms of, it's not like what we think is best is what's going to be, but when you're playing with fire, you're going to have, these random discrete groups out in the wild lighting things on fire. Some are making torches. Some are, like just seeing what things can be lit on fire. And we're one of those groups that's just kind of out on the edge playing with things and trying to design and imagine worlds that are potential and that have properties that we like a little bit more than today. And maybe some of those will filter in, but we don't have the right answers. I'm seeing a lot of things of a lot of questions around ethics and the blockchain, and it's neither good nor bad and whatever, but we need to explore some of these areas with an open mind is also.
This gets back to IDEO's general philosophy on prototyping and why our kind of atomic unit of work is prototyping. Is the purpose of a prototype is to break it and figure out where it breaks in a low risk environment. And so I think a lot of that needs to happen. Like, this stuff is not ready for prime time at all. There's a bunch of questions on smart contracts. Do you want to give a short introduction to what a smart contract even is?
Yeah, smart contract is a piece of code that is public, that everybody agrees upon, and runs in an environment on a blockchain right now. So it does a thing and everybody can see what it does. So maybe it distributes coins, maybe it takes some action and distributes money when some event happens in the world, like the outcome of some game happens, and maybe it distributes the outcome to a group of people who are interested in that, and then that outcome is provable and back to the contract.
Cool. We have one more question to take. I think this one about data sharing and privacy, I think it kind of relates to smart contracts. So there's things like zero knowledge proofs maybe that could be part of this ecosystem that are really interesting.
Peggy's asking, how do we protect privacy and secure information in an open data sharing ecosystem? So without getting too technical, just know that there are tools. There are things like zero knowledge proofs, which mean that people can agree upon a thing that sits inside of a box, and you don't even need to know what's inside of the box if you're one of those parties. You can prove something without knowing what it is.
The tangible example of that people use here is if you go to a bar in the United States, you have to be 21 to drink alcohol. So today you have to show your identification, which has your picture, your address, your age, and other information about you, your height, your weight. Like, the person who's letting you into the bar doesn't need to know any of that. They just need to know if you're over 21 or not. And things like zero knowledge proofs allow for you to ask a question of the data without knowing what the data is. And that could be a way to protect privacy.
Yeah. So there's lots of ways to protect privacy here. So that's the good answer, Peggy, is there's lots of ways to protect people. we just need to design the system with those ways in mind.
Cool. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Hopefully that was interesting. Hopefully you learned something. If you want to learn more, I think following the IDEO CoLab on Twitter is a great way. We're posting links that we've written, things that we've written, but also things that we just see out in the world that we think is interesting, whether it's related to the distributed web and blockchain, or machine learning and artificial intelligence, or otherwise, like just cool stuff. And just to plant a little seed, we're going to have a little fun scavenger hunt around the crypto space starting on December 25th. So follow our Twitter if you want to participate in that. And thank you to IDEO U for being our teammates on this. This has been an awesome opportunity, and hopefully we'll get to do more of these with them in the future. Happy holidays. And as our friend Diego Rodriguez says, don't get ready, get started.